She did not run. That was the first thing Medusa noticed. Every human who had ever stood in her presence had run, or fallen, or begged, or wept into their palms until the stone floor swallowed the sound of them. But this girl, this small, barefoot girl with dried mud on her knees and a crown of wilted flowers in her hair, stood at the foot of the obsidian steps and looked up. Not at the serpents, not at the throne, not at the guards whose spears trembled. She looked at Medusa's face. She looked and did not turn away. There are moments that split a life into before and after. Medusa had lived 10,000 years and learned to recognize them. The moment a kingdom forgets mercy. The moment a mother chooses power over her child. The moment a girl who should have run instead meets the eyes of the most feared creature in the ancient world and refuses to flinch. This was one of those moments. What the girl wanted would cost her everything. What Medusa would give her was something she had never given anyone. And the price would not, or blood, or years. It would be paid in truth. And truth, as Medusa had long since learned, was the most dangerous currency in any age. If this story pulled you in, like the video and follow Medusa's Memories. Tell us, what state are you listening from? The kingdom of Thessalorn had a law older than its stones. No one looked at the queen, not directly. Fully. Those who did, by accident, by arrogance, by the catastrophic luck of turning at precisely the wrong moment, did not die. That was the mercy the stories always omitted, because mercy sounds like weakness. And the kingdom had been built on the idea that Medusa was not weak. Those who looked were changed. A finger to marble, a shoulder, a giaulini. It crept across the body like a tide of winter, slow and inevitable, until what had stood breathing in her presence became something permanent and pale and very, very still. The last man who had looked had been a general. His army found him 3 days after his private audience with the throne. Frozen mid-stride in the outer courtyard, one hand raised as if to shade his eyes. They carried him to the edge of the kingdom and placed him facing the valley. A warning, the council said. A monument to the cost of arrogance. The soldiers who had done the carrying never quite met each other's eyes afterward. Some things, once witnessed, live in the body long after the mind tries to release them. This was the world Tessa walked into. She was 11 years old, though 11 felt too ordinary, a number for what she was. The village that had sent her, Erith, sat at the base of the mountains that separated Thessalorn from the lower territories. And Erith was dying in the way that places die when they have been forgotten for long enough. Not quickly, not dramatically, slowly, the way a fire goes out when no one has bothered to add wood, the outer logs cold first, then the center, then one morning you wake and find the ash already gone pale. The wells had run dry in the 2nd year of the drought. The fields were cracked clay and memory. The children had stopped crying from hunger because they no longer had the energy. Tessa's mother had sent her with a message written on a piece of bark because they had no paper. The message said, "Please." That was all. One word, in her mother's handwriting, small and careful and already beginning to smear from the rain. Tessa had walked through to reach the capital gates. She had walked for days, slept twice on the road, eaten what she found along the way. At the gates, the guards had laughed. Not cruelly, in the way that people laugh when something is too strange to process as real. A child, barefoot, carrying a bark scroll, requesting an audience with the queen. "Go home," one of them said, not unkindly. He had daughters. He could see them in this girl's particular species of stubbornness, the set of her chin, The way she held the bark scroll with both hands as if it were the most important document in the known world, which to her mother it was. "I can't," Tessa said. "There is no home to go back to, not until the wells are fixed." The guard looked at his colleague. His colleague looked at the ground. Then, because something in the girl's voice carried a weight that neither of them could identify as manipulation, because it was simply true, they sent a runner to the council. The council sent her away. The council's messenger, a thin man in gray robes who moved as if he'd spent his entire career trying not to occupy space, delivered the response with the practiced neutrality of someone who has delivered bad news so many times that he has learned to inhabit it without feeling it. The Queen did not receive petitions from villages. The Queen did not receive petitions from children. The Queen's time was governed by a schedule that had been established by 3 generations of administrators and could not be disrupted for drought. Tessa looked at the man for a long moment. She had walked for days. Her feet were bleeding under the mud. The bark scroll was damp and beginning to soften at the edges. "Then I'll wait," she said. She sat down on the steps of the council hall and waited. She waited through the afternoon heat that rose from the stone in waves. She waited through the change of guards at the outer gate. She waited through a la rain that started before sunset. Kanawa latih. She ate nothing because she had nothing to eat. A woman from a nearby market stall brought her half a loaf of bread and set it beside her without a word. These small, anonymous generosities that cities produce in response to visible human endurance. The kind of kindness that asks nothing in return except to be allowed to happen. Word reached Medusa at the 3rd hour past sunset. She was in the map room. She was always in the map room at that hour, alone, studying the shifting borders of the territories, the way another person might study the faces of people they have loved and lost. The messenger knocked 4 times before entering, because that was the protocol, and then delivered his report with his eyes fixed precisely at the level of Medusa's collarbone. "A child," Medusa repeated, "from Aerith, my queen. She has been sitting on the council hall steps for 6 hours. She has eaten half, a loaf of bread given to her by a vendor. She has not moved. She has not wept. She has not made demands." A pause. She is simply waiting. Medusa was quiet for a moment that stretched in a way that made the messenger's collar feel suddenly tight. "Bring her." The messenger blinked. "My queen. She is. The protocols. I know what the protocols are." Medusa turned back to the map. "Bring her." Tessa was brought through the outer halls of the palace, with her eyes wide open and her chin level and her dirty, bare feet making soft sounds on the marble. She noticed everything: the height of the ceilings, the torchlight, the inhabited quality of the silence. She was shown into the throne room and told to stop at the boundary line, a thin inlaid stripe of darker stone that circled the base of the dais, 3 steps below where the throne sat. The guards positioned themselves behind her, not touching her, not needing to. The message was architectural, this far and no further. Medusa sat on the throne the way she always sat, without performing it. One knee slightly higher than the other, one arm resting on the carved serpent head that topped the right armrest. She wore no crown. She had never worn a crown. Crowns, she had said once to a council member who had suggested it, were for people who needed to remind others they were in charge. The serpents moved in her hair with the slow, purposeful rhythm of creatures who had learned to be where they were without anxiety about it. Tessa stood at the boundary line and looked at the Queen's face. The guards went rigid. The Queen's personal attendant positioned at the far left of the throne room, made a sound she immediately suppressed. Medusa, who had not been looked at directly in 47 years, felt something happen in her chest that she could not immediately name. The girl was looking at her the way people look at something they have been told is dangerous, but have decided, upon direct examination, to evaluate for themselves. Not without fear. There was fear in the girl's face, clearly visible, not hidden. But the fear was not in charge. Something else was in charge. Something older than fear, or maybe younger. Some species of determination that had been born in the body before the mind learned to second-guess it. You walked for days, Medusa said. Yes, Tessa said. Alone. Yes. Why did you not send an adult? A council representative from your village. Tessa was quiet for a moment. Then, we don't have any left. The headman died in the winter. The 2 council members left before the wells ran dry. They said there was no point staying. She paused. My mother is too sick to walk. My older brother is 6. Everyone else is too hungry. Another pause, smaller than the first. So it was me. Medusa looked at the bark scroll in the girl's hands. What does it say? Please. Tessa's voice was steady. Isis, please. My mother didn't know what else to say. She said that every argument she could make, someone with more power had already thought of and rejected. So please was all she had left. The silence in the throne room had changed quality. It was no longer the silence of a space held in careful suspension. It was the silence of something about to happen. Come closer, Medusa said. A guard moved. Not much, just a small shift of weight. Medusa raised one finger, fractionally, and the guard stopped. Tessa walked to the base of the dais steps and stopped. She was close enough, now, that the torchlight caught the individual strands of her hair, the particular texture of the dried mud on her shins. The way her fingers had whitened slightly around the bark scroll from holding it for so long. What do you want from me? Medusa asked. I want you to fix the wells. Tessa said it without decoration. And I want to know why they broke in the first place. Because my mother says they didn't just run dry, that something changed in the ground. And if we don't know what changed, the new wells will break too. Medusa was quiet. That's 2 things, she said. Yes, Tessa said, but they're the same thing. One doesn't work without the other. The girl was right. Medusa had been visited by petitioners for centuries, kings, generals, merchants, desperate mothers. Clever advisors, philosophers with arguments structured like elegant weapons designed to find the gap in her reasoning. None of them had ever made her feel, as this girl made her feel, that she was looking at something genuinely new. Do you know what happens to people who look at me? Medusa asked. Yes, Tessa said. They turn to stone. Aren't you afraid? Tessa thought about this, actually thought about it, visibly, the way children think when they are taking a question seriously rather than performing consideration of it. I was afraid, she said, for the first part, when I was coming through the gates. But then, she stopped. Then I thought if I look away only what they say. And if you are only what they say you are, then you can't help my village. So I'd rather look and find out. In 47 years, no one had said anything like that to her. In 400 years, Medusa would think back to this moment as the one that changed the direction of everything that came after. Not because of what she decided, but because of what the girl's words cracked open inside her. Something she had calcified over, slowly. The way a wall grows over a window, the knowledge that being looked at was not the same as being seen. And that she had been afraid, for a very long time, of the difference. She should have sent the girl away. The protocols were clear. The precedent was unambiguous. And there was a reason, a real reason, not just tradition, that audiences with the throne operated the way they did. The walls of Thessalorn were old. The treaties that held them in place were older. And in the center of every treaty, every law, every carefully negotiated agreement that kept the kingdom from sliding back into the wars that had defined the era before. Medusa's reign was the assumption that Medusa was what she had always presented herself to be. Untouchable, unchanged, a fixed point in a world of shifting allegiances. She was about to break that assumption. She knew it as she opened her mouth. She knew it as the words formed. She knew it the way you know, sometimes, that a decision is irreversible before you have finished making it, a door swinging open that will not close again. And on the other side of it, a new shape of everything. Stay, Medusa said. You will eat. You will sleep. Tomorrow we will speak about Aerith's wells, and about the things beneath them. Tessa looked at her for one more moment. Then she gave a small nod, not a bow, exactly, though not disrespectful. More like an acknowledgement between equals who have agreed to deal with each other honestly. Thank you, she said. None of the guards moved. None of the attendants spoke. The throne room held the particular, suspended quality of a moment that knows it is historic and is waiting for those present to catch up with that knowledge. In the corridor outside, the council's messenger, who had been positioned near the door in case the queen needed anything, and who had heard everything through the gap, pressed his back against the wall and stared at the ceiling and understood, with the particular clarity that comes from witnessing something irrevocable, that nothing in Thessalorn was going to be the same. He was right. He simply did not yet know in what direction the change would go, whether toward ruin or toward something else. Something that had no name yet, because it had never happened before in the kingdom's long and carefully documented history. The girl slept that night in a chamber 3 floors above the throne room, in a bed that was softer than anything she had ever imagined a bed could be, with a tray of food beside her that she ate methodically and completely, and without the urgency of someone who is starving. Because she was just past the point where the body forgets what full feels like, and she was teaching it to remember. And Medusa stood at the window of the map room and looked out at the dark shape of the mountains and thought about what it meant that a child had walked for days to stand in front of her and refused to be afraid. The answer she arrived at was not comfortable. But then, comfortable answers had never been the ones that mattered. The council did not take the news quietly. They never did, but this was different quality of noise than their usual deliberations. Their usual noise was organized, structured into the shapes of argument, position, counterposition, precedent, exception. The careful choreography of people who have learned to disagree within established boundaries. This was something Roar, Lord Casvin, who had represented the Eastern Territories for 30 years and who prided himself on his composure, actually raised his voice twice. A village child, he said, and the word child landed in the chamber with the weight of an accusation. Sleeping in the Queen's palace, eating the Queen's food. And tomorrow, she is to be given an audience. A formal audience, as if she were an ambassador. As if she had any standing whatsoever too. She has standing, said Lady Preth, who represented the mountain territories, and who rarely spoke, but when she did. The room shifted in her direction the way a field shifts toward rain. She walked for days. Her village is dying. She asked for help. That is standing enough. The precedent is going to be set regardless. The question is what kind? Lady Preth's voice was flat and precise. If the queen gives this girl an audience and helps her village. The precedent is that desperation with courage is sufficient to reach the throne. If she does not, a pause. The precedent is that we do not help the dying because it is inconvenient to do so. Lord Casvan looked as if he had bitten something sour. The wells of one village are not the business of the throne. The wells of one village are always the business of the throne when the throne is what holds the kingdom together. Lady Preth folded her hands on the table. How many other villages do you think are watching this? The answer was, all of them. The council knew it. Messengers moved through the territories like blood through a body, carrying news from the small places to the large ones and back again. And by now, barely a day after Tessa's arrival, the story had already begun its migration. A child walked to the palace. The queen received her. The queen told her to stay. That story was going to reshape something. The only question was what shape it would make. What none of them yet knew, what Medusa was, even as the council argued through the night. Quietly arranging was that the wells of Erith were not a local problem. Medusa had spent the night in the archives. The palace archives occupied 3 underground levels beneath the east wing, and they were Medusa's preferred retreat when she needed to think. Because the scholars who worked there had learned over the years that the queen's presence in the archives meant she was working. And working meant she did not want company, and not wanting company from Medusa meant something quite emphatic. The scholars had developed a refined technique for being absent in occupied space. They worked. They breathed, they turned pages, but they did not exist in any way that required acknowledgement. She had pulled the geological surveys. She had pulled the water records, fort rainfall record depth, seasonal flow. She had pulled the treaty documents from the original territorial negotiations, which had been conducted to centuries ago when the shape of Thessalorn was still being argued over, when the mountain territories and the lower valleys were separate entities with separate water rights. Before the drought accords of 1130 had created the shared reservoir system that now supplied the eastern villages. She found it at the 4th hour past midnight. The reservoir. The eastern reservoir, which was supposed to be managed by a joint commission of the mountain and valley territories, which had its own separate set of records, which, and this was where her hands went still on the document, had been last audited 18 months ago. 18 months ago, the audit had noted some modification to the outflow system, a new valve installed, an adjustment to the distribution channels. Authorized by Lord Casvan's office. Authorized by Lord Casvan's office. Lord Casvan, who represented the Eastern Territories. Lord Casvan, whose family estates sat in the valley north of Erith. Lord Casvan, who had been quietly, methodically redirecting water from the villages at the base of the mountains to increase the flow to his own lands. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough to be ruinous over time. The wells of Erith had not simply run dry. They had been made to run dry. And the man who had done it was currently downstairs, arguing about precedent and protocol, and had been doing so with the confidence of someone who did not believe anyone would ever look closely enough to find what he had done. He had not anticipated that a girl with mud on her knees would walk for days to sit on a step and wait. The thing that Medusa felt when she set the document down was not, precisely, anger. She had lived too long for simple anger. Anger was clean and hot and resolved itself quickly. And what she felt was something more complex and more enduring. It was the particular cold fury of someone who has been made by another person's choices to be complicit in something she would not have chosen. Lord Casfin's manipulation of the water system had gone on for a year and a half under her administration. She had not known, she had not looked. And that, the not looking, was a kind of failure. She did not forgive in others and would not forgive in herself. She summoned him at dawn. Not through the council. Not through the formal channels that would have given him time to prepare, to arrange his explanation, to arrive already shielded in the particular armor of plausible deniability that powerful men in long positions of authority learn to construct with impressive speed. She sent a personal guard to his chambers at the first grey light before sunrise, with a message that said, "Come now." And when Lord Casfin arrived in the map room, still pulling on his coat, his face carrying the expression of someone who has not yet decided whether to be insulted or afraid, she set the documents on the table between them and watched him look at them. He was very good. She had to give him that. The expression on his face moved through surprise, and then past it, so quickly that someone watching from across the room might have missed the transition. Arriving at something that tried to arrange itself as concern. "My queen," he began. "Don't," Medusa said, quietly, not with anger, with something that made anger look imprecise. "Don't perform confusion for me. It costs us both time we do not have." He looked at her then, not fully, not the way Tessa had, but the sideways look of someone calculating. Medusa had learned to read sideways looks. This one was computing. What does she know, and how much of it can be managed? "The modification was approved by my office," he said, finally deciding that acknowledging the documented fact was more useful than denying it. "The Commission recommended an efficiency improvement to the distribution system. I authorized it. I did not review every downstream effect. 18 months, Medusa said. Aerith's wells have been failing for 18 months. Children are malnourished. The headman is dead. Their remaining population is..." She stopped, restarted. "You knew. I had concerns about the efficiency of the existing. You knew." Her voice had not risen. "That was, somehow, worse. You sat in this council for 18 months, knowing that a village was dying because of a decision you made. And you said nothing. And you attended every council session and raised concerns about budget allocations and border patrols. And you said nothing." Lord Casfin was quiet. In the silence, outside the window, the city was beginning its morning, the sounds of markets opening, carts on stone, the particular percussion of a capital that has never stopped to consider what holds it up. "The Commission," he said finally, "found the modification to be within acceptable parameters." The Commission, Medusa said, was composed of 3 people, 2 of whom sit on the council of your family's estate. He had no answer for that. "Here is what will happen," Medusa said. She had not sat down since he entered. She stood at the window with the dawn light, beginning to define the edges of her, the precise line of her shoulders, the slow movement of the serpents in her hair. "The water system will be restored to its original configuration. Immediately, an independent audit will review all modifications made under the Commission's authority for the past 5 years. The cost of rebuilding Aerith's infrastructure will come from your estate, not from the kingdom's general treasury, but specifically and transparently from you, because that is proportionate to what was taken." She paused. "And then you will appear before the girl downstairs, and you will explain to her what happened and why. Not through a representative, not through a statement delivered on paper. You will stand in front of her and tell her yourself." Lord Casfin's jaw had set. "My queen, I must advise against. I am not asking for your advice on this point." Medusa turned from the window. I am telling you what will happen. The alternative, she let the words sit. The alternative is that everything I have just described happens anyway. Except that it also becomes a matter of public record in the full council. And you lose not just the cost of restoration but your position, your lands, and the specific reputation you have spent 30 years constructing. It was a dilemma without a clean exit. He could choose the version that cost him less. But that version required him to stand in front of a child and confess what he had done. And that kind of confession, in front of witnesses, on record, had its own costs. Costs that moved through the social architecture of the kingdom in ways that were slow and permanent. He chose it anyway. Because the alternative was worse. Agreed, he said. And then, because he could not help himself. The residue of 30 years of practiced authority leaking through even now. She is a child. Yes, Medusa said. And you knew that when you decided a village of children was an acceptable place to absorb your efficiency improvements. She moved toward the door. The audit begins this morning. What she did not tell Lord Casvin, what she did not yet have the words for, was the other thing the night in the archives had shown her. The water modification was documented, recoverable. The Commission's authority could be audited, the damage calculated, the restoration funded. Those were solvable problems. They were the kind of problems that have shapes you can hold and then put down. What the night in the archives had also shown her was how many other things she had not looked at. How many other systems, how many other small adjustments made in the margins of commission reports. How many other places where someone with a position and a patience had made a quiet choice that was moving through the kingdom's body like a slow poison, arriving eventually as catastrophe in some village too small to have reach, too distant to have a voice, too forgotten to send anyone but a child. She had ruled for 400 years. She had believed, because the kingdom was large and the throne was present and her laws were enforced, that she was governing it. She was beginning to understand that governing and seeing were not the same thing. That you could be in charge of something and still not know what was happening inside it. That understanding was the second loss. The first had been innocence about Lord Casvin. The second was something larger and harder to name, the loss of the certainty that her presence was, by itself, enough. That she had built something that ran cleanly. She had not. She had built something that ran, and running cleanly were not the same. Tessa was awake when the attendant came to bring her breakfast. She was sitting on the windowsill with her knees drawn up to her chest, looking out at the city below, the way you look at something large, when you are small and you are trying to hold all of it in your eyes at once. Because you know you will need to carry it back with you, the shape of it, the detail. She ate quickly and efficiently. She had learned to eat quickly. The body has a memory of scarcity that lingers even when the immediate scarcity is resolved. The attendant, whose name was Bryn and who had worked in the palace for 20 years, and who had developed, over those years, a set of very precise opinions about which visitors were trustworthy and which were not, found herself watching this child eat and feeling something she was not accustomed to feeling in professional contexts. Concern. Not pity. Pity was a distance. Concern was closer and warmer and less comfortable. "The Queen is coming to speak with you this morning," Bryn said, gathering the tray. Tessa nodded. She did not seem surprised or anxious. She seemed, Bryn thought, like someone who had made a decision about how they were going to approach something and had finished making it, and now just had to walk through the door. What Tessa was actually feeling, she would not have had the words for it then. would find them years later was the particular weight of knowing that someone else was going to be hurt by what she had done. Not hurt the way she had expected, not simply inconvenienced or annoyed by her presence and her request, but actually damaged. She had felt it last night, lying in the soft bed, in the particular way that bodies process what minds are not yet ready to hold, a tightness across the chest, a shallowness of breath. Something was wrong in this palace that her walking here had surfaced. She didn't know what. She didn't know how she knew. But she had learned to trust the knowing. She was right to trust it. She simply did not yet know the shape of what was coming, that the thing she had surfaced was larger than one village's wells, larger than one lord's choices, large enough to reshape the throne and the woman who sat on it, and that the price of that reshaping would fall, in part, on her. The confrontation happened in the great hall, with witnesses. Medusa had not intended it this way. The plan, if it could be called a plan, which implies a level of certainty she had not felt since the moment she opened the archive documents, had been for Lord Casvan to speak privately with Tessa first, in the presence of only Medusa and to scribes, a confession contained, a reckoning proportionate. But the council learned what was happening. Of course they did. Councils have their own intelligence systems, their own networks of attendants and messengers and people positioned in corridors for exactly this kind of information. And the message that spread through the council chambers that morning was specific enough to alarm. The Queen was moving against Casvan, and the pretext was a village child and a water commission report. They came to the great hall because they could not afford not to. Their presence was not solidarity with Casvan. Several of them, Lady Preth among them, were quietly satisfied by what they understood to be happening. Their presence was self-interest, if the Queen was using administrative overreach as grounds for public reckoning. Every one of them needed to understand the new shape of the rules, because most of them had their own commission reports and their own small modifications, and their own careful arrangements that had seemed, when made, like reasonable applications of their authority. So there were 32 people in the great hall when Lord Casvan stood before Tessa. Tessa had not been told this part of it. Bryn had brought her to the hall and told her that the Queen had asked her to come. And then the doors had opened into the space, full of people in formal dress. And Tessa had gone still in the doorway for one moment, a single beat of recalibration, and then walked in. Chad leval, back straight, mud still on her shins, because there had not been time this morning. Or perhaps because she had not asked for it to be removed. Or perhaps Medusa watched her from the throne and wondered this because she had decided, somewhere between the palace gate and the archive in this room, that she would not let the palace make her into something more presentable and therefore easier to manage. Lord Casvan stood to the right of the dais, with 2 guards positioned behind him, not touching him but present. He had dressed carefully this morning, full formal wear, the kind that takes time and attention and communicates a certain kind of dignity. He had tried to armor himself in ceremony, and the attempt was visible, which was worse than if he had not tried. Tessa walked to the boundary line and stopped. She looked at Casvan the same way she had looked at Medusa, directly, without flinching. But differently, not evaluating whether the dangerous thing was also something more, but measuring something else. She was reading him, Medusa thought. 11 years old, and she was reading him. "This is Lord Casvan," Medusa said. "He has something to tell you." Casvan began to speak. He had prepared something. Medusa could hear its structure underneath the words. The careful architecture of a man who has spent 30 years managing narratives. The language was of systems and unintended consequences and the complexity of water management across large territories. The language was true, technically. It was also shaped to minimize, to distribute responsibility, to arrive at an explanation that was accurate in its facts and dishonest in its weight. He spoke for 2 minutes. And then Tessa said, "Did you know the wells were failing?" Casvan stopped. "Did you know," she repeated, "that when you changed the water, the wells in our village were failing? Not at the beginning, later, when you knew." The great hall was very quiet. Casvan looked at the queen. Medusa looked back at him with an expression that communicated, precisely and without ambiguity, that she was not going to help him. "There were reports," he said. "The commission received notifications. Did you know?" Tessa's voice had not risen. It was still the voice she had used at the gates, the voice of someone who has made a decision about what matters and is not going to be moved from it by anything that isn't a real answer. "Yes," Lord Casvan said. The word came out differently from everything he had said before it, quieter. Something in him that had been held very carefully for a very long time shifted, barely perceptibly, under the weight of a child's direct question. "How long?" A pause that lasted long enough for everyone in the room to understand that they were watching something they would remember. 11 months, he said. Tessa was quiet for a moment. In the quiet, Medusa watched her process, watched the calculation move through her face. 11 months. Her headman had died in the winter, 7 months ago. The children in her village had stopped crying from hunger. She had told Medusa that, because they know how the energy 11 months. "Okay," Tessa said. She said it as if it were the end of something, or the beginning of something, or both. Lord Casvan blinked. "Okay. I needed to know if you knew. Now I know." She turned toward the throne. What happens next? What happened next was that Medusa spoke. She outlined, in the formal language of a royal decree, the council scribes writing as she spoke, the terms of the restoration, the water system configuration, the independent audit, the estate funds, the timeline. 30 days for initial restoration, 90 days for full infrastructure repair. The accountability was specific, named, and public. When she finished, she looked at Lord Casvan. "Do you accept these terms?" "Yes," he said. He had gone pale under his formal wear. The pallor of a man who has been reduced, in front of witnesses, from a position he had held for decades, and who knows that the reduction is permanent, that you cannot unbecome. In other people's minds, the man who knew for 11 months and said nothing. He left. The council filed out in small groups. In the particular configuration of people rearranging their understanding of their world while maintaining the exterior structure of composed professional adults. Lady Preth, passing Tessa on her way out, paused and looked at the girl for a moment and then walked on without speaking. But her face held something that, in another context, might have been called recognition. Bryn had been standing near the door. She was crying, quietly, in the way of someone who was embarrassed by it. She had spent 20 years in this palace, and she had served to queens before this one, and she had never, not once, cried in a formal hall. She could not entirely account for why she was crying now. She thought it might have something to do with the fact that the child had asked, "Did you know?" And the man had said 11 months, and the child had said, "Okay." Tessa came to stand beside the throne when the hall had emptied. "The wells will be fixed?" she asked. "The wells will be fixed," Medusa said. "Within 30 days, the primary flow will be restored. Within 90, the infrastructure will be rebuilt. Your village will have what it needs." Tessa nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the other villages. The ones like ours. Are there others like ours? This was the question Medusa had been waiting for, not because she had expected Tessa to ask it, but because she had known, since the archives the previous night, that it was the question that mattered more than all the others. The answer was yes. She had spent the morning pulling commission reports, cross-referencing audit notes, and finding the same pattern in different configurations in for other locations. Not all Casvin's doing. Some of them were different lords, different systems, different quiet modifications. All of them producing the same slow drain from the places too small to reach the throne. Yes, Medusa said. There are others. Tessa looked at her. Are you going to fix them? Yes, Medusa said. And then, because the girl deserved the full answer, I did not know they existed. Should have. I am going to have to change how I govern to make sure I know about the places that cannot reach me on their own. Tessa was quiet for a moment, considering this. How? Medusa looked at her. I don't know yet. But you showed me that the current system is insufficient. Someone has to look at the places that are forgotten. Someone has to go there. I could help, Tessa said. She said it the way she had said everything, directly, without ornamentation. Not offering herself as supplicant, not as performance of virtue. Just, I could help. The way you say it, when you have assessed what's needed and you have something that's relevant, and the withholding of it would be a waste. In the history of Thessalorn, no monarch had ever appointed a village child as anything. The protocols were clear. The appointments that held real function in the kingdom were drawn from the council class, from the administrative class, from the families who had spent generations learning the form and language of institutional power. Those were the rules. Those rules existed for reasons: experience, accountability, the architecture of trust built slowly over time. Those rules were also, Medusa was beginning to understand, how the places too small to reach the throne stayed small. How the people who could not speak the language of institutional power stayed silent. How a man like Casvin could redirect water for a year and a half, because the only people who would notice were people whose reports never arrived at the right desks. Not yet, Medusa said. You are 11. You should go home to your mother. You should see the wells restored. You should grow. A pause. But yes, when you are old enough, if you still want to. Yes. Tessa looked at her for a long moment. Something passed across her face that was complicated and human and too layered to name simply. Okay, she said. The word she used for endings and beginnings. The cost that Medusa had not foreseen arrived 2 days later, in the form of a delegation from the Eastern Territories. Lord Casvin had communicated his new situation to his allies before the Audit Commission could begin its work, and his allies had communicated to theirs. And the resulting document that arrived on Medusa's desk at the 3rd hour past sunrise was 40 pages long and represented, collectively, the largest formal challenge to the Crown's authority in 60 years. It accused the Queen of unilateral action without council vote. It accused her of accepting a petition outside the established protocol. It questioned in language that was careful and lethal the basis of authority for a royal decree that reorganized water rights based on the word of a child and the overnight review of an archive. The document was signed by 14 lords. 14 lords was not a majority. It was not sufficient, under the kingdom's constitutional framework, to force a throne review, but 14 lords was enough to destabilize. Enough to shift the terrain in which Every decision the throne made for the next decade would be interpreted and contested. Enough to make the restoration of Aerith's wells something that had to be defended at every step, rather than simply done. Medusa read the document once. She set it down. She stood at the window for a long time, looking at the city below, at the mountain outline beyond it, at the particular quality of the light that came through high clouds in early spring, and made everything look both more real and more fragile than it usually did. She had known there would be a cost. She had known the moment she said stay to the girl in the throne room, had felt it, the door swinging open, the irrevocability of it. But she had expected the cost to be paid by Casvin and by herself in the smaller currency of a more complicated political climate. She had not fully accounted for the size of the force she was about to push against, or the force it would push back with. She had also not accounted for something else, something she would only understand later. Looking back, that the moment she had been honest with Tessa, when she had said I should have known, and I did not, and I am going to have to change, was the moment she had become, for the first time in 400 years, genuinely visible. Not the way a monument is visible, not the way a threat is visible, but the way a person is visible when they let another person see them fail and stay anyway. She had been seen, and being seen, she was now a target in a different way than she had ever been before. That was the cost she had not seen coming. The door opened. It was Bryn. The girl wants to know if she should leave, Bryn said. She heard the delegation arrived. She said she doesn't want to make things worse for you. Medusa turned from the window. Outside, the city was doing what cities do. Persisting, markets, carts, the particular percussion of ordinary life that continues regardless of what is happening in the rooms above it. Tell her, Medusa said, that she did not make this harder. She made it necessary. A pausi. Tell her to stay until the first water convoy reaches Aerith. She should see it. And the delegation, Bryn asked. Medusa picked up the document. 40 pages. 14 lords. 60 years. I'll answer them, she said. She did not say, I have been afraid of this for a long time. She did not say, I have been managing carefully for 400 years, specifically to avoid this confrontation. And a child walked in and made the avoidance no longer possible. And I am, for the first time in longer than I can clearly remember, unsure what happens next. She said, I'll answer them. And she sat down and began to write. Outside, a cloud passed over the sun, and for a moment the room went grey, and then the light returned. The first water convoy reached Aerith 19 days into the 30. Medusa rode with it. This, too, was not the plan. The plan had been a dispatch, water engineers, a representative from the Audit Commission. Funds transferred through the administrative channels that moved money, through the kingdom the way rivers move through rock. Invisibly and efficiently. The plan was governance at distance, which was what she had practiced for 400 years. Because governance at distance maintained the necessary separation between the throne and the things the throne was governing, which was how the throne remained the throne. But she had been writing the response to the 14 lords for 2 days. And somewhere in the writing, she had understood something she did not know how to put down once she had picked it up. That the response she was drafting was a defense of a philosophy of governance she no longer entirely believed in. She was writing arguments for why the Crown's authority to act without full council ratification was historically grounded and constitutionally valid. And all of those arguments were true, and none of them were the real answer. The real answer was, She had not been looking, and she should have been. And the thing she was defending was not her legal authority. She was defending the idea that presence from a distance was the same as governing, and it was not. She had known it for 2 days, had known it since the archives, had known it in a deeper sense since the moment she had looked at Tessa and felt something calcify inside her begin to crack. She had written 60 pages of legal argument. Then she had set them aside and ridden to Erith. The village was smaller than she had known. Even with the surveys, even with the archive documents, even with the detail that Tessa had provided, the reality of Erith was different from her understanding of it. Small places have a texture that numbers cannot carry, the particular quality of afternoon light in streets that have gone quiet, the sound of an economy at its floor, the way buildings in a place that is struggling hold there, where differently than buildings in places that have money for maintenance. Everything in Erith was doing its best with less than enough. The wells were dry. She could see this, the rings of stone, the empty interiors, the ropes that ended in buckets sitting at the bottom in whatever moisture remained. The fields were cracked and pale. 3 houses had been abandoned, their owners gone to somewhere else. Somewhere, with water, the logic of survival making its adjustments, without ceremony. But there were people. More people than she had expected, given the scope of what Tessa had described. 40, maybe 50. Adults and children clustered near the edge of the village, where the road came in, watching the convoy arrive with the particular stillness of people who have learned to hold their reactions until they know what a thing actually is. Tessa was there. She had ridden back with the advance party 2 days earlier, and she was standing near her mother, a woman who looked like an older, thinner version of the girl, with the same specific quality of stillness in her face. Tessa had one hand on her mother's arm, not holding it, just present. Contact without weight. Medusa dismounted. She had not been in a village, any small place off the administrative map, in 60 years. The last time had been different in every dimension, different context, different era, different understanding of what she was doing and why. She was aware. Standing in the packed earth of Erith's central square, with the convoy behind her, and the villagers ahead of her, and the dry wells all around. Of the distance between that last time and this one. Of what she had told herself that distance represented. Order. The proper functioning of institutional authority. A queen who remained in the palace was a queen who maintained perspective. What she had lost, she understood now, was not perspective. It was contact with the thing that governance was supposed to be for. She walked to where Tessa stood with her mother. "This is my mother," Tessa said. Enna looked at Medusa with the wary directness of a woman who has survived enough to be skeptical of things arriving with promises. Not with fear. Fear was a luxury that had been crowded out by more pressing needs. With assessment. She walked for days, Enna said, not by way of gratitude. Just, this is what she did. This is the fact. I know, Medusa said. I am sorry it was necessary. Enna looked at her for a long moment. The wells, she said. The engineers will begin today. The primary flow restoration should be complete within 10 days. The infrastructure. Medusa stopped. She had been about to speak in the language of the council chamber. The administrative language that moved efficiently and communicated nothing of what was underneath it. You will have water again. For drinking. For the fields. The system that caused the failure will not be able to fail in the same way again. It will be under independent audit. Permanently. Enna nodded. Then, slowly, without drama, why did you come yourself? The question landed in the square, and everything around it went quiet. The way things go quiet when a question has found the center of something. Medusa thought about the 60 pages she had set aside. She thought about 400 years of governance at distance. She thought about the general, frozen mid-stride, who had been placed at the edge of the kingdom as a warning. She thought about the way she had sat on the throne for so long that she had confused staying still with stability. "Because I should have come sooner," she said. "Because I did not know this place existed until a girl walked for days to tell me about it, and that should not have been possible. A place this close to the palace should not have been able to disappear." Anna looked at her for a long time. "It didn't disappear," she said. "We were here. You weren't looking." There are truths that land so precisely that there is nothing useful to do with them except hold them. This was one of those truths. Medusa held it. "Yes," she said. "That's right." The engineers worked through the afternoon and into the evening with torches. The villagers watched in shifts, some of them helping when they could, carrying materials, holding lights, doing the small useful things that people do when they need to be part of the work that is being done for them. Because being only a recipient is its own kind of helplessness. And these were people who had spent enough time helpless already. By the following morning, the first well was flowing. The sound of water in a dry place is not like other sounds. Medusa had forgotten this, or had never known it as a sound, only as a statistic, an engineering outcome. A line in an audit report that read flow restored, 47%. The sound was something else. The people of Erith heard it, and some of them wept and some of them did not, but stood very still. And the children ran to the well and put their hands in the water as it came up. And one small boy drank straight from his cupped palms and then laughed. The way children laugh, when something is so good that the body can't contain it as just relief and needs to express it as joy. Medusa watched this from across the square and felt something she had not felt in a very long time and could not have named clearly. The specific ache of someone who has been living at a distance from the thing that matters and is, for a moment, close to it again. Not comfortable. It was not a comfortable feeling, but real, more real than a great many things she had felt in the previous decade. Tessa came to stand beside her. "Thank you," she said. "You did this," Medusa said. "You walked. You waited. You asked the right question." Tessa considered this. "I just asked the questions I needed the answers to," she said. "The questions that mattered to my family. I didn't know they would matter to anyone else." Medusa looked at her. In the morning light, with the sound of the well behind them and the boy still laughing somewhere in the square, Tessa looked like what she was, a child, 11 years old, with mud on her shins and a piece of bark scroll still tucked into her belt because she had not let go of it. Not since she had carried it for days. "They always matter," Medusa said. "That is what I have spent for centuries failing to understand. The questions that matter to one family always matter to the kingdom. The kingdom is made of families. I was governing the architecture and forgetting what it was built to hold." Tessa looked at the well. Achi, her mother, who was standing near it with her hands in the water, not saying anything. At the small boy who was still laughing. "I want to come back," Tessa said, "when I'm old enough, the way you said. I want to be the person who goes to the places that can't come to you." "I know," Medusa said. "Will you still be there?" "When I'm old enough." Medusa looked at her. In 400 years, she had been asked many versions of this question. Will you still be here? Will you still be in power? Will this kingdom still exist? Will you remember this? Usually the question was strategic, people wanting to know the stability of the arrangement. Tessa was asking something different. She was asking whether the person she had met, the one who rode to a village, instead of sending a document, the one who had said I did not know and I should have, was the real one. Or a temporary version that would retreat, eventually, back behind the throne. Yes, Medusa said, I will be there. And I will be this. She paused. I cannot promise you everything, but I can promise you that. The truth, she did not say, the one that arrived in the quiet of that morning like the specific feeling of a weight she had not known she was carrying. Beginning to shift, was that she had been afraid, not of the 14 lords, not of the council, not of the formal challenge to her authority. She had been afraid, for 400 years, of exactly this, of being known well enough to be genuinely disappointed in, of having someone close enough to see her fail. Tessa had walked for days and stood in front of her and looked directly at her face and refused to flinch. And the thing Medusa had been afraid of, being seen, being known, being close enough to the human consequence of her decisions to be held accountable by it, had happened. The girl had seen her, not the throne, not the serpents, or the stone-making gaze, or the 4 centuries of accumulated legend. The woman who had not been looking at the places that were disappearing. She had been seen, and she had not turned to stone. The kingdom Medusa rode back to was the same kingdom she had left. The 14 lords were still there, their documents still on her desk, their challenge still requiring a response. The council was still configured the way it was configured. The architecture of power, all the treaties and protocols and carefully negotiated agreements that held the borders and the taxation and the peace was still standing. But she was not the same person who had ridden out. She answered the 14 lords, not with the 60 pages of legal argument, with something shorter and more direct, an acknowledgement that the decree had been unilateral, that it had set a precedent, and that the precedent it had set was this: the throne intended to know the places that could not reach it, and to respond to their needs without waiting for those needs to arrive through proper channels. And if that required a different relationship between the throne and the council, then that conversation was open, and she was ready to have it. 3 of the 14 lords signed on to that conversation, for withdrew their signatures from the challenge. 7 maintained their opposition, which meant the challenge was below the threshold for a constitutional review, and the decree stood. It was not a victory. It was the beginning of a longer rearrangement. Medusa would not go to Tessa's village again for 2 years. When she did, the wells were rebuilt. Enna was stronger. And Tessa, now 13, had been teaching herself to read. Administrative documents in the council archives she'd been granted limited access to. She had found another Erith, a different village, different territory, different lord, same pattern. The same slow modification, the same quiet assumption that no one was looking. She had found it the way you find a lie in a story, when you know what the true version sounds like. The truth that arrived then, the final, devastating truth that Medusa would carry for the rest of her 400 remaining years, was this: the kingdom had not been missing the ability to see these places. It had been missing the people who looked at them without having been taught what they were supposed to find, who brought questions that mattered to their families, and trusted those questions, and followed them wherever they led. She had spent 400 years building a throne. She had spent 11 days learning that the throne was not the point. The point was the boy by the well, cupping water in his hands and laughing. The point was the girl who walked for days and refused to look away. The point, the whole enormous, complicated, vulnerable living point, was the thing the throne was supposed to protect and had forgotten to look at and could not protect again without looking at. When the girl looked back at Medusa, the throne had trembled, not because of what the girl was, because of what she made Medusa see. The throne did not tremble because it was weak. It trembled because someone had finally made it feel the weight of what it was supposed to carry. If this story reached your heart, leave us a like and share it. What would you have done? And don't miss what comes next. Another memory Medusa never forgot.